Nobody told me I'd be standing next to history that afternoon. I just wanted a coffee. That's the honest truth of it. I've been walking the East Terrace for 2 hours, my feet doing that particular kind of screaming that only cobblestones produce, and all I wanted was to find a bench, sit down, and drink something hot before the Windsor sky decided to do what Windsor skies always threaten to do. Then, sideways, I found the bench. The rain found me first. It had been a Tuesday. I remember specifically because Tuesdays at Windsor Great Park are what I'd call aggressively ordinary. Not the grand tourist crush of Saturdays, when the coaches idle 3 deep along the long walk, and every other person is holding a selfie stick like a scepter. Not Sunday's quiet. Either that particular church bell hush that settles over the whole estate, and makes you feel you've wandered into someone else's memory. Tuesday is something else. Tuesday is locals walking dogs that have seen better decades. It's retired men with expensive cameras who know all the guards by name. It's school trips from SLU, 28 children in high-vis vests moving in a formation that their teacher is trying and failing to maintain. I was watching one of those school trips when it happened. The children were bunched near the statue, the big equestrian one, where tourists always pause to have their photographs taken because the angle makes it look like the horse is about to gallop directly into their forehead. The teacher, a woman somewhere in her mid-40s with the particular expression of someone who has been doing this since before half her students were born, was counting heads. Out loud, under her breath, with the focused desperation of a woman who has lost one before and will not lose one again. 34, 35, 30, she stopped. I noticed because her clipboard dropped just slightly against her hip. One of those small body betrayals that only happen when something catches you genuinely off guard. I followed her gaze. He was standing maybe 40 meters away, on the far side of the graveled path, near the hedge line where the formal garden begins to bleed into the wider park. No entourage that I could see, or rather, the 2 men flanking him at a respectful 10-pace distance were dressed well enough and standing still enough that my eye had logged them as architecture before I understood they were people. He was in his late 20s. Dark coat. No hut. His hair was doing something in the wind that I suspect required significant effort to look that effortless. One of the school children, a girl, maybe 8 years old, yellow high-vis vest, one plate coming undone on the left side of her head, had walked directly up to him. Not toward him, up to him, with the absolute social fearlessness that belongs exclusively to children who have not yet learned to be afraid of important people. She said something. I couldn't hear it. The wind was running the wrong direction, carrying her words back toward the hedge. But I saw his face do something, a small thing, a recalibration, the kind of expression that appears when a person of considerable adult seriousness is suddenly confronted with a completely reasonable question delivered by someone who is 4 feet tall. He crouched down. That was the moment. Right there. Not a performed crouch. Not the PR-rehearsed bend at the knees that you see in official photographs. The kind that communicates I am relatably human while remaining essentially untouchable. This was something else. This was a person getting low enough to actually meet a child at eye level, which requires a genuinely unself-conscious commitment to the angle. He was in the dirt. Basically, the hem of that very good coat was millimeters from the gravel. The girl showed him something in her hand. I couldn't see what it was. Something small. Something she'd apparently found important enough to approach a stranger about. He looked at it. Not a glance. He looked the way you look at something when you're actually trying to understand it, not just acknowledge it. 3, for seconds. His head tilted slightly left. Then, he said something back to her. She burst out laughing. Not the polite little girl laugh. The real one. The one that involves the whole face. The one that kids produce before they learn that public laughter has a volume limit. I was still watching when the photographer materialized. That's the only word for it. Materialized, because I genuinely did not see him arrive. One moment there was just the scene, the park, the girl, the man in the dark coat crouched in the gravel. The next moment there was someone with a long lens standing near the garden entrance, and the shutter was going. Not aggressive, not paparazzi frantic. He was working quietly, efficiently, the way a person works when they know they have something. The prince, and I was certain by now that was who he was, not from any dramatic recognition, but from a simple accumulation of detail. The stillness of the two flanking men, the way even the dog walkers had begun drifting closer without quite knowing why. The prince did not look at the photographer. He was still talking to the girl. She had sat down on the path. Just sat down, cross-legged on the gravel, apparently unbothered by the complete social impossibility of this, and was showing him the small thing in her hand in a more detailed way now, gesturing, explaining something with the thorough seriousness of a scientist presenting findings. He sat down too, not beside her. In front of her, mirror image, so they were facing each other like two children who've decided this patch of gravel is as good a place as any for an important conversation. The teacher had stopped counting. She was just standing there, holding her clipboard, watching. The expression on her face was the specific one that humans produce when they are witnessing something they know they will describe for the rest of their lives, but are afraid to move in case they break it. I found out later, much later, that evening, in the particular way that information travels now, which is to say that someone on the other side of the world found it before I did despite having been 40 meters away, what the photograph looked like. Him in the good coat, sitting cross-legged on gravel in Windsor Great Park, looking at whatever the girl was showing him in her palm, his face in profile, entirely concentrated. The caption someone wrote was 3 words. This is enough. By midnight, it had been shared 200,000 times. By the following morning, it was in the papers, not the tabloids, or not only the tabloids, but the kind of papers that usually regard photographs of royals as a necessary professional obligation rather than something worth genuine column inches. They all said some version of the same thing, that he looked present, that he looked like a person who had decided, in that moment, that the most important thing in his vicinity was a small girl with something in her hand. What none of them knew, what I knew, because I was there, because I was watching from the bench with my cold coffee, was what had happened immediately before. I'd seen him come through the garden gate. I'd seen the brief conversation with the man in the earpiece. I'd seen the slight stiffening of the shoulders, the jaw doing the thing jaws do when they're being professionally controlled, the eyes doing the scan and catalog that people in complicated positions do in public spaces, always working out the geometry of the room, always calculating. He had been tired, not publicly tired, not in any way a camera would catch, but in the way a person is tired when they've been performing composure for so long that composure itself becomes the exhausting thing. And then the girl walked up to him, and something unlocked. Here's what I kept thinking about on the train back. Not the photograph, not the 200,000 shares, not what the papers said in the morning. I kept thinking about the coat hem in the gravel, the calculation that does not get made in that moment, the instinct toward the unpolished thing, toward actual contact with the ground rather than the appearance of contact, that no advisor tells you to perform because advisors tell you to perform things, and this was not a performance. You cannot teach a person to sit in gravel with a child and not look at the camera. You either have it or you don't. And the brutal, uncomfortable thing, the thing that sat with me on the train, the thing that is still sitting with me now, is that it doesn't matter, whether you have it or whether you don't. The photograph exists. 200,000 people saw the photograph. They felt something. That feeling is real. The gravel is real. The girl's laugh was real. But the story that 200,000 people are now carrying around, the story of who he is built in one afternoon, in one image, in 3 words of caption someone typed on their phone, that story is faster than the 30 years of actual living that preceded it. Legacy is not the life. Legacy is the moment that gets photographed. The life just has to produce enough of those moments to make the story coherent. I thought about that for the whole of the train journey home. I'm still thinking about it now. The second time I encountered him was not photogenic. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about royals or about anyone who becomes a version of themselves that other people carry around. There's the image. There's the story the image generates. And then sometimes if you're in the wrong place or the right place, depending on how you look at it, there's the actual person. In a room, being a person, it's a jarring thing. My friend Priya works for a heritage foundation, one of the smaller ones, not the famous ones with the royal patronage splashed across their letterhead, but the quiet kind that actually does the work, sourcing artisans, documenting dying crafts, try to put money in the hands of the people doing the thing before the thing disappears entirely. She'd invited me to an evening event. A fundraiser, technically, though Priya uses the word fundraiser the way some people use the word dentist, with a resigned acknowledgement that is necessary and will involve some discomfort. There'll be an important guest, she'd said on the phone. How important? A pause. Wear the gray dress. I wore the gray dress. The venue was a converted hall somewhere between Kensington and the part of Kensington that pretends it isn't Kensington. Old stone, good acoustics, the kind of exposed timber that costs twice what plaster would, and looks 3 times as expensive. Someone had arranged flowers that appeared to have been chosen for the specific quality of wilting picturesquely rather than blooming conventionally. There were perhaps 60 people in the room. Not a crush, but enough to generate the kind of ambient conversational noise that means you have to lean slightly toward whoever you're speaking to, which gives everything a sense of intimacy that might or might not be manufactured. I had a glass of wine, I wasn't really drinking, and was looking at a woven panel on the far wall. Part of the Foundation's exhibition, thick natural dyes, the kind of textile that makes you aware of how many hands and how much time a single object contains, when Priya appeared at my elbow. "He's here," she said. "Where?" "Behind you." "Don't look." I looked. He was standing near the entrance, in conversation with the Foundation's director, a compact, brisk Scotswoman named Margaret who has the particular quality of people who have spent their lives being taken less seriously than they deserve, which is to say, a quality of absolute internal stillness, a complete lack of interest in performing impressiveness, and the habit of saying precisely what she means without scaffolding. He was listening to her, actually listening, not the public-facing approximation of listening, not the occasional nod, the maintained eye contact that is really just waiting for your turn. He was leaning slightly forward, weight on his front foot, and there was something happening in his expression that I can only describe as work. He was working to understand what she was telling him. You could see the effort, not the effort of concentration exactly, more the effort of recalibration, of a person adjusting their existing framework to fit information that doesn't quite match the shape of what they already knew. Margaret was explaining something about dye sourcing. Indigo specifically, the supply chain issue, the way synthetic alternatives have undermined the economic viability of natural cultivation, the knock-on effect on the families for whom cultivation is not a romantic heritage project, but simply income. He asked a question. I was close enough to hear it. "What does it cost," he said, "to make the synthetic the worst option economically, rather than morally?" Margaret looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been asked a genuine question in a room full of polite noise and is recalibrating. "That's the right question," she said. "Nobody asks that. What's the answer? We don't know yet. That's what the research phase is for. Then, let's fund the research phase. Now we should consider funding. Not I'll have someone look into this." The present tense, direct. Let's. Margaret wrote something on the card she was holding, and whatever the number was, her hand didn't hesitate. What happened in the next 20 minutes is harder to narrate because it didn't happen in a straight line. He moved through the room the way water finds the lowest point. Not strategically, not with the press-flesh efficiency of the committed networker, but following something. Whoever was most animated, whoever was standing slightly to the side of the main conversational cluster, holding their wine a little too carefully, looking at the exhibition panels with the focused attention of someone who came because they actually cared about the work. He found those people first. I watched him spend 11 minutes. I checked my watch twice because it seemed implausible, talking to an older Ghanaian weaver named Kofi who'd been brought over by the Foundation to demonstrate a particular technique. Kofi's English was functional but not comfortable, and he communicated primarily through gesture and through the cloth itself, pulling threads to show tension, running a thumb across the surface to indicate texture. The prince ran his thumb across the surface too. Not performing. Checking. The way you check something when you want to understand it through your hands rather than through someone else's description of it. Kofi noticed. His face did something. A small opening, a slight lowering of the particular guardedness that very skilled people in very decorated rooms develop as a default posture, The protection against being appreciated for being a spectacle rather than understood as a craftsman. They didn't share much language. They shared about 30 minutes. The photographs from that evening were published the next day. There were two main ones that circulated. The first was the predictable image. Him at the podium, having said a few words toward the end of the evening, brief, well-phrased, the language of someone who has been taught to value brevity and has actually learned the lesson. He looked good. He looked appropriately serious. It was a good photograph of a royal at a heritage fundraiser. The second was the one that traveled. Someone had caught him with Kofi, the moment when he'd run his thumb across the weaving. From the angle, you couldn't see the texture of the cloth clearly. What you could see was his face turned toward Kofi's hands, and Kofi's face turned toward his. Two people in a room full of 60 people, and the room containing only each other. The caption was something about cultural exchange and royal patronage and the foundation's important work. The comments were something else. He actually cares. Look at the way he's looking at the old man's hands. This is who he is when no one's watching. Except, of course, someone was watching. Someone with a camera is always watching. That's the nature of the room he inhabits. The room upstairs, the room where perception is the architecture and every window faces out. And here's the thing that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. He did care. That was not performance. I was there. I watched 11 minutes of it. But the comment says this is who he is when no one's watching. And the paradox is that the comment exists because someone was watching. The image of the unwatched moment is itself the most watched moment of the evening. The authenticity is real. The documentation of the authenticity is what makes it legacy. And you cannot have one without the other. You cannot say this is who I really am and also be the kind of person whose authentic self never gets seen. The being seen is the part that gets built into story. The story is the part that outlasts the room. I left early. Priya was deep in conversation with a textiles journalist and waved me off with a particular wave of someone who is exactly where they need to be and doesn't need rescuing. On the street outside, waiting for the cab that had been circling the same block for 6 minutes in that particular London cabway, I stood under a narrow overhang while the rain that had been threatening all evening finally made its commitment. I thought about what he'd said to Margaret. Let's fund the research phase. For words, present tense, plural, no fake. Whatever came of that, whatever meeting was scheduled, whatever number eventually landed in the foundation's account, whatever research eventually produced, whatever finding, the beginning of it was 4 words in a room I happened to be standing in. But nobody will write about the 4 words. They'll write about the photograph of the man and the weaver. This is who he is. And they won't be wrong. That's the cruelest part of it. They won't be wrong. They'll just be describing a smaller, more visible, more photogenic slice of the thing that was actually happening. The photograph is true. The caption is true. The feeling people carry after seeing it is true. And the 4 words, the practical, financial, unglamorous, slightly boring words that might actually change whether a family in rural Ghana can sustain their livelihood for another generation. Those words exist in a room that 60 people were in, and will be remembered by approximately 4 of them. Legacy is not the action. Legacy is the image of the action. The action is what the image has to be made of, or it hollows out eventually. But eventually is a long time away. Right now, in the immediate architecture of story, perception builds faster. Every time. The 3rd time, I didn't see him at all. I heard about it from a man named David Osei, who was standing outside St. James's Palace on a February morning that had the specific quality of February mornings in London, which is to say, colorless, damp, and faintly hostile to the idea that warmth exists anywhere on Earth. David sold newspapers from a stand on the corner of Marlborough Road. Not a proper kiosk, one of the old fold-up ones, the kind that are technically illegal now, but exist in a gray zone of civic tolerance because the city can't quite bring itself to remove the last few men who've been doing the same thing in the same spot since before the road had its current name. I bought papers from David maybe a dozen times. He had the quality of very good street vendors everywhere. The ability to conduct an entire transaction while simultaneously conducting 2 or 3 other transactions, and one internal monologue, all without anyone feeling shortchanged. He was from Accra originally. He'd been in London 31 years. He had a son at university in Leeds studying civil engineering and a daughter who'd just started secondary school and was, in his assessment, going to run something eventually. He delivered these facts the way he delivered change, efficiently, warmly, without fanfare. That February morning, he told me what he'd seen. 3 days ago, he said, early, before the tourists. He said it had been maybe 6 in the morning. The particular darkness of early February, the palace lit from within in that way, it sometimes is when the sky is still deciding whether to bother with daylight. He'd been setting up his stand, which involved a particular choreography of unfolding, waiting, and securing that he's performed so many times it's purely physical memory, his hands doing it while his eyes are elsewhere. His eyes were on the gate. There was a guard, a young one, David said. You could tell from the way he held himself, still slightly performing the stillness rather than inhabiting it. The proper bearskin, the proper coat, the correct angle of absolutely not looking at anything. But young enough that his stillness had a visible architecture to it, a slight awareness of his own posture, a self-consciousness that the older ones had metabolized into genuine blankness. A woman had stopped in front of him. Middle-aged, David thought. Not a tourist. No camera, no map, sensible shoes, the particular purposeful walk of someone who lives in the area and uses the pavement in front of the palace as a route rather than a destination. She'd stopped because her phone had rung, which happens, and she'd stepped to the side to take the call, which put her approximately 2 feet in front of the guard. She was crying before the call, was 20 seconds old. Not loudly, not the public grief that makes bystanders freeze and look away and look back and look away again. Small crying, the kind where your voice stays mostly functional and only the edge of it gives you away, the slight thickness, the control breath. The guard did not move, which is correct, which is the job. Stunt. Do not engage. Perform immovability so completely that tourists can photograph you mid-sentence, and you will appear as furniture. This is not cruelty. It is contractual. It is professional. It is the agreed terms of what he is doing in that spot. He did not move, and then a car pulled through the gate. David said the car slowed as it passed the guard, which they sometimes do, a brief pause at the gate, a nod from inside, a routine acknowledgement. The routine thing. The window came down. Not all the way. Halfway. The way you lower a window when you want to hear something better. David couldn't see who was inside from his angle. The light was wrong, the gate was at a distance, and in any case he was watching the woman who had finished her call and was standing with her phone against her chest, and her eyes doing the thing eyes do when they're trying to hold something in. What he saw was the car stay. 5 seconds. 10. Longer than a routine pause. Then, the door opened. The man who got out was in a coat David recognized. Not the man, the coat. Dark, clean lines, the kind of coat that London produces occasionally in the early morning on people who have somewhere important to be and dress accordingly. He walked to the woman. David said he didn't know what was said. The distance was wrong, and the morning was too quiet. Paradoxically, the quietness made him reluctant to strain toward it, as if listening too hard would break something. What he saw, the man standing beside the woman, not in front of her, not at the helpful stranger's slight distance, but beside, which is a different geometry entirely, which is the geometry of being present rather than assisting. He said something. She looked up. She nodded. After a moment, David couldn't say how long, she walked away. Not upset walking, not the rigid-spined walk of a person holding themselves together by force of will. Just walking. Moving again. The man went back to the car. The car moved through the gate. David told me all of this without particular drama. The way he'd tell me about anything else he'd seen from that corner over 31 years. The way someone tells a story when they've had time to sit with it and stop being surprised by it and are now just curious about what it means. Did you recognize him? I asked. Not then, David said. After. He'd been thinking about it, he said. Thinking about the coat. And then, that afternoon he'd seen the photograph, the Windsor Park one, the gravel one, and put the coat and the coat together. I don't know if it was him, he said. I think it was him. I thought about what to say. It might have been anyone, I said. David looked at me. He has very steady eyes, The eyes of a man who has spent 31 years watching the same street and has developed a comprehensive taxonomy of human behavior from that vantage point. Might have, he said. Here is what I have been sitting with since that morning. David did not take a photograph. He saw something, or thinks he saw something, or saw something that might have been something, and he went home and he thought about it. And the next day, he went back to his corner and set up his stand and sold papers. He told me about it 11 days later because we were standing in the same place and the topic came up naturally. No image, no caption, no shares. Just a man on a corner who watched a car door open in the early morning dark and a figure walk toward a crying woman and stand beside her, not in front of her, beside, which is the geometry of presence, and then get back in the car. That act, if it happened, if it was who David thought it was, will not be in any record. It will not be cited. It will not be used in the eventual biography or the documentary or the long retrospective piece that someone will write 20 years from now about who he was and what he built and what he left. It will live in David Osei on a corner on Marlborough Road in the specific texture of a memory that has no image attached to it. And the thing that I cannot get out of my head is that it might be the realest thing. Not the photograph in the gravel, not the image of the two men and the weaving, not any of the things that traveled, that got captioned, that produced feelings in people who weren't in the room. A woman crying, a car stopping, a door opening, nobody watching except a man who sells papers and has steady eyes and 31 years of human observation from the same corner. That might be the thing, the actual thing. The one that doesn't generate legacy because it has no image, because it moves too fast for a long lens, because the light was wrong and the distance was wrong and David wasn't even sure. I've been thinking since then about what a prince understands. Not what he knows. He knows plenty, I suspect. The education is thorough. The briefings are comprehensive. The history is drummed in from a very early age with the particular thoroughness of an institution that understands it is custodian of something that can be broken. But what he understands, I think there's a moment, I don't know when it comes, whether it's gradual or whether it arrives in a single afternoon like weather, when a person in that position understands that they are building two things simultaneously. The first thing is what they actually do. The decisions, the conversations, the 4 words in a room with a Scottish woman and her card, the thumb on the weaving, the car stopping, the geometry of beside rather than in front, the small things that are expensive in time and attention that require a person to actually be present rather than perform presence, that produce nothing immediately photographable. The second thing is the story, the image, the caption, the 200,000 shares. The comment section full of people who weren't there feeling something true about someone they've never met based on a fraction of a second that a stranger captured in good light. These two things are not opposites. That's the part that's hardest to hold. They're not opposites, and they're not the same thing. They're parallel tracks that occasionally intersect, the gravel moment, the weaving moment, and the intersection is where a legacy gets made in the bright collision of the real and the perceived. But the tracks run separately most of the time. Most of the time, the real is dark and quiet and unmeasured and witnessed only by a newspaper vendor on a corner who isn't even sure. And the perceived is lit and captioned and shared and felt by people who carry the story of a person they will never sit beside in any geometry. David handed me my paper that morning and made change with the specific economy of a man who has made change 10,000 times. He was in a hurry, David said, almost as an afterthought. But he stopped. That was it. That was the whole of what he offered me. He was in a hurry, but he stopped. I've been turning that sentence over for weeks, turning it the way you turn something small and interesting in your hand, checking the weight, checking whether the weight is evenly distributed or whether it's heavier on one side than the other. He was in a hurry, which means the stop was a choice, an active interruption of momentum, of schedule, of the forward motion that someone in a car with a gate to pass through is already committed to. A car in motion has physics. Stopping has physics too. It requires the same decision that turning requires, which is, this thing over here is more important. right now than the thing I am moving toward. But he stopped, and nobody saw, and it might be in him somewhere, the understanding that most of what he is will not be seen, will not be documented, will not produce the photograph that produces the feeling, that produces the story that outlasts the room. And he stopped anyway. Maybe that's where it begins. Not an understanding that legacy is built faster in perception than in action. Though I believe that's true, I've watched it happen 3 times now in a period of months. I've seen the speed at which an image travels versus the speed at which an action compounds. But in understanding it and then choosing to act anyway. In the dark, in the wrong light, with no one watching except a man on a corner who isn't even sure. I went home that February morning and made tea and sat at my kitchen table for a long time without doing anything in particular. Outside my window, London was doing the thing it always does, proceeding without asking anyone's permission, in the particular relentless, ordinary way of very old cities that have seen enough to find very little surprising. I thought about a girl with a plate coming undone, showing something small in her palm to a man who sat down in gravel to see it properly. I thought about Kofi's hands on the cloth and a thumb that understood what it was touching. I thought about a woman on a February pavement with a phone against her chest and the shape of someone standing beside her in the particular geometry of presence. None of these things are connected except by the thread of the same person moving through the world in a particular way, imperfectly under pressure, occasionally documented, and usually not, building something that is 2 things simultaneously and has to be both or will eventually become neither. I don't know how the story ends. I don't think he does either. I think that might be the point. The ending is the part that gets written last. And it gets written by people who weren't in any of these rooms, who will look at the photographs, the gravel, the weaving, whatever image eventually becomes the one that the retrospectives reach for, and feel something true about a person they never sat beside, and carry that feeling forward, and call it knowing, and not be entirely wrong.